Hi there, I'm Waverly. After my father's funeral, my sister seized control of our family company and $500 million that was supposed to be shared. I thought betrayal ended there, until a hidden journal surfaced, revealing secrets my family buried deep. How far would someone go to erase you from your own story? What would you do if your own family turned against you? Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own home? What time are you listening to this, and where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I really want to hear your story. The air hung heavy that afternoon, thick and unmoving, as if Houston itself had forgotten how to breathe. I stood at the edge of Greenwood Cemetery, staring at the polished granite headstone that now bore my father's name. The grass around it was freshly turned, raw against the manicured rows of the older graves. It was strange, surreal, that after all these years of silence between us, I was back here, returning not for reconciliation, but for a goodbye I never truly understood how to say. Family members clustered in small groups under the dimming sky, speaking in low tones, their glances darting toward me, then quickly away. I didn't blame them. My absence from this town, from this family, had been a wound none of us had managed to dress properly. Regret pooled in my chest, thick and warm, as I watched the people I once called kin avoid my eyes. After the funeral, we gathered at my mother's house. The living room, once vibrant with family arguments and laughter, felt hollow now, like a stage after the audience had left. Lilith, my older sister, stood poised by the fireplace, clutching a manila folder against her side. Her voice cut through the thick silence like a polished knife. "I have an update from Father's attorney," she said. "There was an amendment to the will, the company, the estate. They've been left to me." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. My heart stumbled in my chest, a sickening lurch that left me unmoored. Around me, no one gasped, no one argued. They simply accepted it. I stood there, paralyzed, feeling like a guest in my own life. The blood in my veins cooled as the realization seeped in. There would be no inheritance, no recognition, no trace of me left tethered to the life my father built. Later, after the polite condolences and dry handshakes faded into the muggy evening, Richard DeSantis, my father's long-trusted lawyer, found me by the back porch. He slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand and leaned close. "It's not clean," he murmured. "The signature on the amendment, it doesn't match your father's handwriting." I stared at him, the words refusing to settle properly in my mind. Not an oversight, not a misunderstanding, a betrayal, deliberate and chilling. Back at my mother's house, I gripped the steering wheel of my rental car until my knuckles ached. I didn't remember the drive back from the cemetery. My memories kept flickering. My father teaching me how to change a tire, his rare, clumsy hugs, the way his voice used to soften when he spoke about the future he saw for me. Was it all a lie? Or had someone else rewritten our story while I wasn't looking? The walls of my old room closed in around me. The bed was gone, replaced by generic guest room furniture. My life erased one piece at a time. Grief gnawed at the edges of my mind, but it wasn't the grief of death. It was the grief of being unmade, unnoticed. Unable to sleep, I wandered into the garage, the place where forgotten things went to gather dust. Under a sagging shelf and behind a stack of worn-out lawn chairs, something caught my eye. A small, battered metal box with a rusted lock. I knelt down, brushing away the cobwebs with a shaky hand. The box was heavier than it looked, solid and stubborn in its silence. I didn't know what was inside. I only knew, somehow, that whatever was locked away in that forgotten corner was meant for me, and that Lilith had made sure I would never find it. I rose, cradling the box against my chest as if it were something alive, something fragile. For the first time since I'd arrived back home, a spark flickered in my chest. Not anger, not hope, something older, quieter, stronger. I had been erased once before. I would not allow it to happen again. The house smelled like old lemon polish, and something older still, disuse perhaps, or the faint sorrow that sinks into walls after too many things have been left unsaid. When I pushed open the front door, the hinges groaned like a reluctant goodbye. Clara's house, once so full of noise and clutter, stood almost unnaturally still under the gray weight of the afternoon. I had expected grief. I had braced myself for silence. I hadn't expected this. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway like soldiers at attention, marked hastily with my name in blocky, unfamiliar letters. My childhood bedroom had been stripped clean. Old photographs, books with worn covers, birthday cards, even the faded quilt my grandmother stitched when I was 8, all packed away or tossed, relegated to boxes destined for nowhere. It wasn't just cleaning up after the funeral, it was a dismantling. I ran my hand over the topmost box, feeling the roughness of the cardboard, the sharp sting of being methodically erased from the only place I had once belonged. The house whispered back at me in its empty spaces. I was a guest here now, a stranger trespassing in a story that no longer had room for me. It didn't take long to find out who had ordered it all. Lilith, of course. Efficient, polished Lilith, who always made decisions for others without bothering to ask if they wanted her help. This time, she hadn't even disguised it as concern. She said it was time to make room, my mother murmured when I finally confronted her, eyes darting away from mine. She thought it would help. Help what? Bury the past? Redraw the family in her own image? I didn't argue. The words I wanted to scream died somewhere in my chest, heavy and useless. Wandering upstairs, I pushed open the door to what used to be my room. The air smelled of fresh paint and furniture polish. Gone were the posters, the scuff marks, the clutter of books and mismatched furniture. In their place, a sterile guest bed, white curtains, a tasteful print of an anonymous landscape. The room was hollow, a stranger wearing my face. As I stood there, numb, my eye caught on a gleam from the corner of the closet. Pushing aside a stack of spare linens, I found the old jewelry box that had once sat proudly on my dresser. Heart pounding, I flipped it open and found it empty. The charm bracelet my father gave me for my 16th birthday, the vintage pocket watch he had promised would one day be mine, gone. I stumbled back, breath catching. Lilith hadn't just packed away memories. She had sold them off piece by precious piece, like clutter at a garage sale. No warning, no permission, no mercy. The loss struck harder than I expected, sharper than grief alone. My father's watch was never about the metal or the brand. It was about the mornings he taught me to wind it, about the nights he tapped it gently against his palm when deep in thought. It was about all the things he could never say. Now, it was just gone, like him, like everything. I walked the house in a daze, past the empty walls and hollow rooms, tracing the ghost of a life that had slipped through my fingers. Memories pressed against my ribs, birthday parties with crooked candles, Christmas mornings heavy with the scent of cinnamon rolls, whispered bedtime stories about dragons and explorers. They haunted the edges of every newly painted surface. Maybe it had never really been my home. Maybe I had just been borrowing space in a life that was always meant to push me out. By the time I made it back upstairs, the weight of it all had settled into something dense and cold at the pit of my stomach. I needed air. I needed space. In the guest room, tucked behind a dusty cabinet, I found a box, smaller than the ones downstairs, not taped shut. Inside, an envelope rested on a folded piece of cloth. My name, written in my father's careful, slanted handwriting, stared up at me. I froze. The world narrowed to that single slip of paper. Hope, raw and trembling, flared in my chest. Hands shaking, I reached for it. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the scuffed linoleum floors. It was late morning, the kind of time when the store should have felt mundane, almost invisible. Instead, every aisle seemed to sharpen into focus, every glance heavy with a meaning I couldn't quite pretend not to notice. I caught it first in the frozen food section, a lingering look from Mrs. Carter, who used to babysit me when I was 6. Her eyes widened in recognition before she quickly turned her card away. In the bakery aisle, Mr. Jenkins, the man who coached my brother's Little League team, paused too long by the bread display, avoiding my gaze with a stiffness that spoke louder than words. By the time I reached the checkout line, the whispers had started. Soft, like the rustling of tissue paper, but just sharp enough to cut. Snippets drifted toward me, sharp-edged and clumsy. Such a shame. After everything her family did for her, Heard she only came back because of the money. Wouldn't put it past her. You know how some people are. The cashier, a boy too young to understand the weight of rumor, refused to meet my eyes as he bagged my groceries. I left the store with the plastic bags cutting into my hands and something colder settling into my bones. It wasn't until I got home, after throwing the groceries carelessly onto the counter, that I pieced it together. Clara had been tight-lipped since the funeral. Neighbors had kept their distance. There had been too much silence, too much watching from the corner of their eyes. Lilith. Of course it was her. The realization felt like a slap I should have seen coming. I scrolled numbly through my phone, and there it was. An online article from the local paper, written with the slick detachment of someone who wanted to sound sympathetic, but only managed to drip poison. A source close to the Avery family, it read, expressed concern about Waverly Avery's sudden return to Houston after years of estrangement, citing financial motivations. Financial motivations. The words burrowed under my skin, seething. Lilith hadn't just erased me from the will. She was trying to erase me from my own narrative, repainting my story into something sordid and pathetic. The betrayal burned hotter than anything the town could throw at me. I wasn't just losing the company or the house or even the money. I was losing my place in the story of my own life. I spent the afternoon in the backyard, pacing between the broken fence posts and overgrown weeds, trying to outrun the shame that clung to me like a second skin. Every conversation I hadn't had with my father, every letter I hadn't written, every moment of stubborn silence, they all echoed louder now, twisted into weapons I couldn't defend against. At some point, I stopped pacing and just stood there, letting the wind tangle my hair, letting the world press down until I couldn't tell if I was shaking from anger or from something closer to grief. It was never about the money. It was about dignity, about belonging, about being seen. I realized in the fading light that I couldn't fix what Lilith had broken by arguing louder. Every defense I made would only sound like guilt. I had to find another way, to expose the truth, not to convince anyone, but to reclaim myself. That night, when the house was still, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from a number I didn't recognize blinked on the screen. "You're not crazy. There's more. Meet me tomorrow. Richard DeSantis." My heart thudded once, hard enough to shake the walls I had so carefully built around it. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a piece of the truth left to find. The house groaned under the weight of nightfall, the old beams settling into their creaks and sighs. I sat cross-legged on the floor of the guest room, the single lamp casting a yellow pool of light over the dusty floorboards. The envelope lay in front of me, fragile with age, the paper featherlight against my fingertips. I opened it slowly, afraid it might disintegrate with any sudden movement. Inside, folded neatly, was a letter written in my father's familiar scrawl, and a photograph, edges curling, of him standing proudly in front of a house I didn't recognize. His arm rested against the hood of an old pickup truck, a ghost of a smile pulling at his mouth. The letter was brief, but packed with a quiet urgency. It spoke of regrets left unspoken, of mistakes made out of fear rather than malice. And buried within his words was a riddle, a whisper pointing towards something he had left behind for me. Something he had hidden away before Lilith could get her hands on it. Sleep was impossible. Long before the sun rose, I slipped downstairs, careful not to wake Clara, and stepped barefoot into the garage. The familiar scent of motor oil and old wood filled my lungs as I made my way to the rusting hulk of my father's old truck, now more a relic than a machine. I ran my hands along the worn leather seats, the cracked dashboard. Something about the way the passenger side footwell stuck out caught my eye. I knelt, pried open a warped panel, and found a small, battered lockbox wedged inside. It took only a few frantic minutes to find the spare key taped under the glove compartment, exactly where he used to hide his spare house keys when I was a child. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a leather-bound journal. The leather was worn smooth by years of handling, the pages thick and yellowed. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I barely noticed the chill of the garage seeping into my skin. I carried the journal back inside, cradling it like something sacred. Sitting at the kitchen table, bathed in the pale light of dawn, I flipped through the pages. Each entry was meticulous. Lists of hidden accounts, modest stock holdings, deeds to small properties scattered around the county, all in my father's steady handwriting. But it wasn't just numbers and transactions. Tucked between the entries were letters addressed to me, confessions of a man who had struggled with guilt and pride, a man who had been too stubborn to say the words aloud. He hadn't abandoned me. He had tried in the only way he knew to protect me. Tears blurred the words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to grieve the man he had been, not the man I had lost. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming my voice, my story, my place in the world that Lilith had tried so hard to erase. Carefully, I copied the most crucial pages, photographing the ledgers, transcribing the notes. The originals went back into the lockbox, hidden away again in a place only I knew. I picked up my phone and called Richard DeSantis. The line rang twice before his voicemail clicked on. "I found something," I said, my voice steady. "I'm ready to fight." The early morning light crept into Clara's kitchen, washing the faded wallpaper in a soft gray glow. The whole house seemed to hold its breath as I flipped through the journal again, fingers trembling. Something gnawed at me, a vague unease I couldn't shake. That's when I noticed it, the jagged edges where several pages had been ripped out. At first I sat there staring, unwilling to believe it. Maybe they had fallen out? Maybe time had worn them thin? But no, the tear was fresh, the kind that came from hurried hands and a desperate need to erase. My stomach twisted as I closed the journal slowly, dread pressing against my ribs. Whatever was missing might have held the answers I needed, the missing pieces to my father's plan, the final safeguard he tried to leave behind. I found Clara sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a chipped coffee mug. She didn't look up as I entered. I placed the journal down carefully in front of her. "Do you know anything about the missing pages?" I asked, my voice low, too steady. She flinched at the sound. Her fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said after a long pause, but the words lacked conviction. They floated weakly into the heavy morning air and died there. I didn't push. There was no need. The truth, or at least its outline, was already clear in her evasive eyes, in the way her shoulders hunched inward like a child caught in a lie. Someone had gotten to her, someone she couldn't say no to. Lilith. The name tasted bitter at the back of my throat. Later that day, Richard DeSantis called and asked me to meet him at his office. I sat stiffly in the cracked leather chair as he pulled out a manila folder and laid it between us. "I reviewed the paperwork Lilith submitted to finalize the estate," he said quietly. "Waverly, your mother signed away your rights, not knowingly, but it's there, plain as day." He slid a few photocopies across the desk. Clara's signature, shaky and unsure, sat at the bottom of a document she clearly hadn't understood, a document Lilith had undoubtedly pushed under her nose, sweetened by empty reassurances. I felt the floor tilt under me, the walls closing in. Betrayal wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it came in whispers and half-truths, wrapped in good intentions. Clara hadn't been malicious. She had been manipulated, used, and in that realization, a deeper sorrow bloomed, an acknowledgement that not every betrayal was born from cruelty. Some were born from fear, from exhaustion, from love, twisted into something unrecognizable. I walked aimlessly after leaving Richard's office, letting my feet carry me to the small park near the river. Children's laughter floated in the air, a jarring contrast to the hollow thud of my heart. Families didn't fall apart in a single moment. They splintered over time, chipped away by ambition, by silence, by the spaces between what was said and what was meant. Piece by piece, memory by memory, until one day you woke up and realized you were standing in the ruins, and no one else even noticed the collapse. I sat on a cold bench, watching the sun dip low over the water, and let myself grieve, not just for what had been stolen, but for what had never truly existed. The version of Clara who could have stood against Lilith. The sister I once adored. The family I had believed could be repaired if only I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, stayed quiet long enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Richard's name flashed on the screen. "I have proof," his voice said in the voicemail. "Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you have." I stared out over the darkening river, the wind tugging at the hem of my jacket. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The old clock on Richard's office wall ticked so loudly I could barely hear the sound of my own breathing. The room smelled faintly of paper and old wood, a kind of safe familiarity that I clung to as he slid the laptop across the desk toward me. "There," he said quietly. On the grainy footage, I watched as Lilith leaned in close to Clara, voice low, hand resting heavily on my mother's trembling shoulder. Clara's face was pale, her hands wringing in her lap, her eyes darting toward the unsigned papers with the panic of someone cornered. I didn't need audio to hear the words Lilith must have spoken. The promises, the threats, the twisting of guilt and duty into weapons. My chest constricted. Watching my mother, fragile and afraid, give in with a shaky signature was a pain I hadn't braced for. I had always known Lilith was ruthless, but seeing it unfold, frozen frame by frozen frame, made it real in a way nothing else had. "This," Richard said, voice low, "is enough to raise questions, maybe even open an investigation." He leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. "But it also makes you a bigger target." I nodded numbly. Of course it did. Truth always came at a cost. By the time I left his office, the Houston sky had darkened into a heavy purple, the streetlights blinking on like weary sentries. The air was thick with the promise of a storm. When I pulled into Clara's driveway, the porch light was on, a bad sign. Lilith was waiting inside. The living room felt colder than it should have, all sharp edges and unspoken accusations. Clara sat rigid in her armchair, hands folded tightly, eyes on her lap. Lilith stood by the window, perfectly composed, a file tucked under her arm. "We need to talk," she said, her voice honeyed with false civility. Without waiting for a response, she launched into her ultimatum. If I didn't leave Houston, if I didn't drop whatever nonsense I thought I was uncovering, she would file a lawsuit against me for harassment, defamation, anything she could stitch together with her money and influence. She would drag my name through courtrooms and newspapers until there was nothing left of it, and she would enjoy it. I turned to Clara, searching her face for any sign of resistance, any flicker of the mother who used to kiss my scraped knees and braid my hair before school. Nothing, just silence, just guilt etched deep into the corners of her mouth. I had never felt more alone. I didn't argue. There was no point. I let Lilith's threats wash over me, the words slipping off like rain on glass. When it was over, I stepped outside into the humid night air. The cicadas screamed from the trees, the sky so low and heavy it felt like it might collapse onto my shoulders. I leaned against the hood of my car, staring up at the clouds until my vision blurred. She wanted me gone. She wanted to erase me from the family, from the town, from the memory of anyone who might have once loved me. And for the first time I realized Lilith wasn't fighting me for money. She was fighting to own the story, to be the sole author of who we were and who we had been. I pressed my hands against the cool metal of the car, grounding myself. I had a choice. I could leave, tail tucked, and let her win. I could disappear the way she wanted, or I could fight. I thought of the journal hidden safely away, the copied pages, the video evidence, pieces of the truth, sharp enough to cut through even the thickest lies. I wasn't the scared girl who left town years ago, too battered by guilt and expectation to stand her ground. I had learned how to bleed quietly. I had learned how to endure. Now it was time to learn how to fight. Back at Clara's house, I spread the documents out across the bed, the journal copies, the legal files, the damning footage, the evidence of a life stolen piece by piece. My heart thudded steadily as I stared at it all, a slow, rhythmic beat that filled the silence. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered into the empty room. And this time I meant it. The heavy gray sky pressed against my apartment windows, casting everything inside in a colorless wash. I sat stiffly on the worn couch, my phone clutched in one hand, the letter from Lilith's lawyers spread out on the coffee table like a personal indictment, accusations of harassment, defamation, threats of financial ruin buried neatly between lines of sterile legal language. I read it once, twice, and still my hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it. Lilith wasn't just trying to win anymore, she was trying to annihilate me. The urge to run, to disappear before the storm could fully break over my head, flickered briefly, but it died as quickly as it came. I had been silent too long. I had swallowed too many betrayals. Richard's voice on the phone that evening was low and urgent. "She's serious, Waverly. This isn't just a scare tactic. She's ready to destroy you publicly if you don't back off." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink deep into the places already bruised. "And if I fight?" I asked quietly. There was a pause, the kind that says more than words. "You'll need to be ready to lose everything," Richard said finally. "But you might also win something more important." After the call ended, I sat staring at the darkening sky, the city lights blinking on one by one like silent witnesses. The choice laid itself bare in front of me. Cave in and vanish, or carve a line into the ground and dare Lilith to cross it. The next blow came quietly. It was Clara who told me, her voice strained over a quick, guilt-soaked phone call. Eli wasn't allowed to contact me anymore. No visits, no letters, no calls. Lilith's orders. I hung up before Clara could finish her halting explanations. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Eli had been the last thread tethering me to something pure, something untouched by all this rot. Without him, the loneliness clawed deeper, raw and bleeding. The nights stretched longer, the walls of the apartment closing in tighter. Days passed. I spoke to no one. I answered no calls. I began to believe Lilith had finally managed to erase me after all, until one night, when I returned home late from a walk that did nothing to clear my mind, and found something tucked beneath my door. A piece of notebook paper, edges frayed, folded in half with my name scrawled across it in messy, familiar handwriting. Inside, just 7 shaky words. "Don't give up, I believe you." No signature. None was needed. I pressed the note against my chest, eyes burning, and for the first time in days, I smiled through the ache. That fragile belief, offered without conditions, reknit something inside me that had been unraveling thread by thread. I taped Eli's note to the inside of my closet door, where I could see it every morning. Not for revenge, not for money, but for every part of me Lilith had tried to break. That night I gathered everything, journal copies, legal files, the video footage, and laid them out across my kitchen table, a silent army waiting for my command. I stood before the mirror looking at the woman reflected back at me, no longer the trembling girl who had come home chasing apologies, no longer the exile. I whispered to my reflection, voice steady, certain. "You want a war? You'll get one." The fluorescent lights of the Avery Construction Conference Hall buzzed overhead, casting a hard, merciless glare across the polished table and the wary faces seated around it. The air was thick with the hum of thinly veiled suspicion and a tension so tight it might have snapped if anyone dared breathe too deeply. I walked through the heavy double doors, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I carried nothing but a slim black folder tucked under my arm, yet it felt heavier than any burden I'd ever borne. Eyes followed me, some curious, some resentful. I felt the old weight of their judgment, but this time, it slid off my shoulders like rain off stone. I no longer needed their approval. I needed only the truth. I took the floor without waiting for an invitation. There were murmurs of protest, but they died quickly when I placed the folder on the table and slowly began laying out its contents. First, the journal, copies of its most damning pages, each detailing hidden assets and silent preparations my father made to protect me. Next, the footage. The grainy video of Lilith pressuring Clara to sign documents she barely understood. And then, finally, the forged amendments to the will, side by side, with authenticated samples of my father's real signature. Gasps rippled through the room. The polished image Lilith had spent years crafting cracked audibly as the documents passed from hand to hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The truth spoke louder than any rage could. I laid it bare, the manipulation, the deceit, the theft not just of money, but of legacy, of belonging. Lilith stood at the head of the table, face pale, lips pressed into a brittle line. She opened her mouth once, twice, but no words came. The room no longer belonged to her. Then Helen Vargas rose slowly from her seat, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "I remember," she said. "Your father told me himself he wanted Waverly to inherit. He wanted her protected." Helen's testimony shattered whatever defenses Lilith had left. Panic flashed across Lilith's features, chased swiftly by rage, but it was too late. The shareholders turned, a tide shifting decisively against her. And I stood quietly, feeling none of the triumph I thought would come. Only a deep, aching sorrow for what had been lost long before this day ever dawned. As Lilith sputtered denials, trying and failing to claw back her dignity, a strange calm settled over me. Winning wasn't about tearing her down. It was about standing upright in the ruins and knowing that, for once, I hadn't been the one to fall. It was about honoring the pieces of my father that had survived in me, the stubborn hope, the fierce love, the belief that some things were worth fighting for. Security escorted Lilith from the room while the board murmured about new elections, about restructuring, about rebuilding. None of it concerned me. I stepped out of the building into the cold, bright morning, the air sharp and clean in my lungs. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like I was stealing someone else's air. But as the wind tugged at my coat and the sun broke through the low clouds, I knew some battles don't end just because the war is won, some wounds don't bleed where you can see them, and some ghosts don't leave just because you step into the light. The small coffee shop on the edge of town smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, a faint warmth against the chill of the winter morning outside. I cradled my mug between my palms, letting the steam fog the window in front of me. The storm had passed. On paper, I had won. But sitting there, surrounded by the quiet clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on the empty shore after a hurricane, staring at a landscape you barely recognized. The hidden journal was locked away in a safe deposit box now. The courtroom battles were finished, or as finished as they would ever be. Lilith's empire had crumbled under the weight of her own deceit, and yet the scars she left behind felt stitched too deeply to ever be cleanly erased. My relationship with Clara hung between us like a door neither of us knew how to open. We spoke when necessary, each word heavy with things unspoken. Eli's letters, brief, scrawled, bursting with a child's stubborn love, sat folded neatly in my nightstand drawer. I couldn't bring myself to read them all at once. They felt too much like hope, and I was still learning how to hold that without breaking it. In the end, reclaiming the company, exposing the truth, it had never been about revenge. It had been about something smaller, quieter, the right to be seen, to exist in the story of my own life without someone else's hand rewriting my name. Lilith's downfall made headlines for weeks. Financial audits, frozen accounts, whispered rumors about criminal charges. She withdrew from public view, her house shuttered like a tomb. Watching it happen brought no joy, only a distant, aching sadness. She had won the first half of the war by building herself a kingdom on broken promises, but kingdoms built that way always collapse from within. And me? I let it go. I filed the final papers, turned over the company to a neutral trustee, and walked away from Avery Construction forever. It wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never really had been. Houston felt different now. Lighter. Not a battlefield, but a beginning. I applied for a position teaching literature at a small community college, signed up to volunteer at the animal shelter down the street. I let myself imagine mornings that smelled of fresh coffee and library books, evenings filled with soft music and open windows instead of locked doors and whispered wars. Some days, the weight of it all still pressed against my ribs. Some nights, I woke up reaching for something I couldn't name. Healing wasn't a straight line. It twisted and folded back on itself, a path you had to choose again and again. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. I wrote a letter I knew I would never send. I thanked my father for seeing me, even when I thought he hadn't, for trusting me, silently and stubbornly, when he couldn't find the words to say it aloud. I promised him, promised myself, that I would live in a way that honored that trust, even if no one else ever understood. The story of Avery Construction, of Lilith, of everything we had been and lost, it would always be a part of me. But it wouldn't define me. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a book on my shelf, and turned off the light. As I stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the clouds finally broke, and pale sunlight spilled across the wet pavement. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, heart strangely steady. A message from an unknown number blinked on the screen. I smiled softly, tucking the phone away without reading it yet. Some beginnings, I had learned, were better when you didn't see them coming. I tightened my coat against the chill and walked forward into the light, not looking back. Sometimes life hands you battles you never asked for. Not every wound leaves a scar you can show, and not every victory feels like a parade. What matters is not how loudly you win, but how quietly you choose to heal. I learned that true strength isn't about fighting harder. It's about standing firm in who you are, even when the ground beneath you shakes. If you've ever felt erased, silenced, or overlooked, know this. You are still here. You still matter. What about you? Have you ever fought to reclaim a part of yourself others tried to take? I would love to hear your story. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're from, or simply type 1 inch if this story touched your heart. If you didn't connect with it, I respect that too. Let me know why and where you're tuning in from. And if you want more stories that heal, inspire, and speak to the quiet battles we all fight, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your story matters here. Your voice is welcome. Let's walk forward, together.